So it's been a while since we talked. How you been?
Good, good. How are you doing?
All right. I just got done with the day where I taught 8 different sections of first graders how to log into their iPad. So that was
Okay.
first graders are amazing, but I'll tell you, it takes an incredible amount of energy to keep them excited about putting in their email address, which takes them 20 minutes, right? You know, it
Yep,
was
I
like
can imagine.
everything I had. So
Yeah, cool, cool. That's a
yeah.
lot.
So your chapter was actually the first one that I edited in the book. And when I think about it now, it's been almost 18 months since we first
Wow,
started
that's
this process,
unbelievable.
right? And it's awesome that like in 2 weeks, it's actually coming out and people are going to get to read it.
Mhm.
But tell me, so what have you been up to the past 18 months or so?
Yeah, so I think 18 months ago, my math would be maybe wrong, but I think I was still in Phoenix teaching. And since then, I've left. I'm doing a PhD in education now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm studying curriculum and instruction, still involved in education, of course. Teaching pre-service teachers, that's been really great. And getting some time and some space to just think some of this stuff through because it's such a whirlwind when you're in it. And it's just like, just now I feel like I'm coming up for air and being able to kind of get like some perspective on like, all right, what was that? How did it play out? How do we begin to think about it? So that's kind of been the project for the last 18 months or so.
Yeah. And so talk to me a little bit about what it's like to teach pre-service teachers during the pandemic.
It's great, but yeah, the pandemic certainly throws in another element of it. They're in their, let me think, their third and fourth years. So it's about that time when they would start going into classrooms,
Mm,
and they can't do that right now. We're not even meeting in person in our class. So they're having to figure out different ways of what does it look like to become a teacher during COVID.
mm.
And a lot of that has been like online tutoring, and then, of course, districts are like inundated with things that are going on and different requests that they have to fill. And I mean, they're trying to figure this out too at the same time. And so it's really difficult to match them with the district now because the districts are well, just figuring out like, like just moving forward, let alone like get pre-service teachers involved. So a lot of figuring it out digitally, but some really great stuff I think happening too at the same time. It's been really interesting, and the students I'm working with are just super bright, and it's reassuring to wake up and go teach and work with them and just see the future is in my opinion, really good hands.
Yeah, that's great. So talking about the pandemic, I definitely want one of the things that I'd love to do during this interview is to take what you wrote about and take the grassroots Red for Ed movement and talk about some of the lessons that we can apply to some of the issues that are going on right now and some of the ways that teachers are organizing during the pandemic. But before we dive into that topic, why don't
Mhm.
you start by, you do a great job in the chapter of laying out how your role in the Red for Ed movement kind of started and even the beginnings of that movement in Arizona. So why don't you go through that story for those that are watching? And by the way, for those of you that are just joining us, I'm speaking with Noah Karvelis, one of the chapter authors in Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy, new book that's coming out in about 2 weeks. So Noah, go ahead and give us that background story on Red for Ed.
Yeah, so Red for Ed, at least I'll speak specifically to Arizona because that's where I was involved with in teaching. It really is a lot of people. I mean, at the height of the movement, we're talking about a movement of 75,000 people in the street, let alone participating in different ways through the social media networks. And the leadership of it was teachers all over the place. I happen to be one of them. And the union too, really heavily involved. I think that was a key for us. And I think, well, we might get into it later, but we see the work that's still going on in Arizona there right now. And I think some of that's due to that. So my involvement starts in 2018 by responding to a tweet from our union president, still union president, Joe Thomas, who was responding to West Virginia and essentially said, "Hey, did you see what's going on? What do you want to do?" And fired up from watching it, and I tweeted back to him and said, "We want to go out on strike. Like we're sick of this." I had no plans for like doing anything with that other than tweeting it, and just I didn't even know if Joe would respond, but he did respond and was interested in moving that forward. And so he said,
Yeah. So
essentially,
before you go any further, talk about some of the issues that you were frustrated about at the time that made you respond in that way to that tweet.
yeah, well, I mean, it was only my second year, and coming there from Illinois, I was kind of just in shock. I was seeing things like there was not only not a teacher, but there wasn't a sub. And so now you have a class of 45 first graders, things like that happening. There weren't materials. There weren't sometimes enough chairs. It was really crazy. One of the first things I remember seeing too was like in the districts that I went to, public school districts in rural Illinois, um, you would very rarely see like a first or second year teacher. It was like veteran teachers. They were on it. They were great. And this is nothing against young teachers. Of course, I was one, and still, hopefully I still qualify. Um, they're great, but there's a big difference between a 20, 30-year, 40-year teacher and a first or second year teacher. And I remember walking into my district and feeling like, all right, I'm going to have all these 30-year teachers who are going to kind of guide me. And then realizing in Arizona, especially in my district, that wasn't the case. We were all like in our 20s, like just figuring it out. And so that was like a huge shock for me. And I started to realize, okay, they can't keep teachers here. And even the young teachers are coming in for 2 years. 3 years is pretty much like the max that I would see often for most of them, including me. And they would leave. So that, I mean, just like we have issues on top of issues. Students don't have desks, they don't have teachers, they have outdated textbooks, if textbooks at all. And then pictures during the movement start to circulate that, some of these bathrooms don't even have paper towels. So, and then to look at it in just like numbers, we were missing $1.1 billion out of the education budget just from 2008. So I mean, that's a massive sum, and that's kind of how it materializes in the classroom. So that's the stuff that's running through my head coming back from teaching, seeing West Virginia on CNN and all this stuff, and then seeing Joe's tweet. I'm just like, man, we can't keep doing this. And I had, like I said, no plans to really do anything with that. I did not even expect him to reply. I was just pissed off and sent it, but he's a smart organizer. And he took me up on it and realized like, all right, there's something real here. How can we engage with it? And asked me how we move it forward and proposed that I organize my school for a Red for Ed Day. And I didn't even know if we could get that. Teachers were pretty beat down, but I think I misjudged them. They had a lot more fight than I thought at that moment, and it blew up, and we just ran with it.
Mm. What strikes me is, so there's a chapter. There's actually a couple of different chapters that tie together in the book, and they reference each other, and a couple of them point back to the Red for Ed movement. And one of them is by Howard Stevenson, who talks about grassroots organizing and what he calls union renewal, which is making sure that unions are not just focused on teaching working conditions, but they're also focused on professional issues as well, because that's what teachers are really crying out for in the classroom. And it strikes me as you were talking that most of the issues that you brought up were issues that directly impacted teachers' ability to do their job and students' ability to learn, right? Packed classrooms, lack of materials, those kinds of things. And when you describe how you had this interaction with Joe, the president of the Arizona Teachers Union, Arizona Education Association, and how he pointed it back to you and said, okay, these are the things you care about, start organizing at the local level, right? It really it fits in nicely with Howard's concept of union renewal and how things need to work on professional issues from the grassroots up. So talk a little bit about what happened in your school as you started to organize then and how it grew out of there.
I mean, it happened really quick. That was, I want to say, like a Thursday or something, maybe a Thursday or Friday. It was towards the back end of that week. And I talked to one of my friends, Thomas Sandoval, and basically, can we get this going by Wednesday? Do you think that we can organize teachers by Wednesday? He said, let's go for it and just see what happens. So I expect, all right, I got Mr. Sandoval. Maybe I can get 2 or 3 of my friends to do this. But as soon as we started to publicize it a little bit on Twitter, on Facebook, there was a lot of it. I got an email or maybe a DM, I can't remember exactly, from a teacher, Kristen Roberts in Phoenix. And she works for one of the largest districts, the largest district in Phoenix, and said, hey, can we jump on? I was like, definitely. So now like this thing starts to grow, and it's more than just one campus or one district. Now we have like 2 or 3. And it kept just like naturally, organically through social media channels being sent to other people. And they're like, yeah, like I'll wear a red shirt and show up. I'm mad too. And when I went to my school 5 days later for that first Wednesday, we had 100% participation. So I went from imagining even that day waking up like, who knows what this will be, showing up, and we had every single person in red. It was incredible. I'll never forget that. And then later, like on my lunch break or something, I start seeing some of the news reports that like, it's not just my school, but it's like everywhere in the state. Because you see, 75,000, 100,000 people, whatever it might be, on a Facebook, and you don't know what they're going to do. Like they might just be saying they like it or something or sharing it. but so many people showed up, and it was, I think, everything in my wildest imagination, and everything from the other people who I was organizing with, including folks at the union. I think it just blew their mind how this thing, like, we just kind of threw it out there, and it just, teachers were ready, and they took it and they ran with it, and from there they just kept building. They were just constantly like, what's the next step, what's the next step? And that's when I start to link up with other teachers, Rebecca Garelli, Dylan Magella, a bunch of different people who are teachers there, and we just grow it. And we have like this group of about 10 people or so, and union leadership working hand in hand, just asking every day, like, where do we go from here? And just continuing to put one foot in front of the other.
What do you think so I think a lot of people look at this and say, okay, how can we replicate something like that around different issues, right? And clearly different states and even internationally, picked up on the Red for Ed movement and used it in different ways to advocate for teachers and for students. But what do you think the role of giving teachers something that was small and actionable as a way to empower them to feel like they were part of something bigger? What do you think the role of that was in creating a larger movement?
I think it's really big. And from there, like, we use that as our initial thing. Like, all right, let's see where we're at. Can we get people to do this simple thing? And I think that's really essential, to start small, get an easy ask. And from there, we're like, all right, now what's the next step? A little bit more buy. And so we had teachers not only wear the red shirt, but now you're going to post on your social media with a little sign that says 3 reasons why you're Red for Ed. And let's start to vocalize what's going on in our schools. And we continue to escalate from there. Eventually we start mobilizing in person. And of course, eventually we end up with a multi-day walkout. So for us, it was just these continual steps of like, how do we not only continue to engage the people we're already engaging, but how do we expand that base? How do we grow their power? And eventually, too, we started to really turn over a lot of that power when we had what we were calling site liaisons, where it's like, all right, not only are you wearing a red shirt, not only are you posting, not only are you going to the protest, now you're in charge of your school site, or maybe you're in.
So it looks like I may have lost Noah for a second, but I'm going to jump in for a second and maybe add a little context here, or Noah's doing a great job of adding context, but add a little bit to his story. So I think that had the Red for Ed movement started with the idea that there was going to be multi-day walkouts, you wouldn't have been able to get a whole lot of teachers who would have jumped on board. But Noah's description of starting with something that was small and actionable, like wearing a red shirt and a bunch of teachers coming together, and then moving into, okay, let's post 3 reasons why we're Red for Ed and why our schools need to change, why there needs to be more funding from the state government, coming down, how does that impact our students? And then moving that to the next step, to eventually where you could get a bunch of teachers collectively taking action to make sure that their colleagues and that their students are being taken care of, I think is an incredibly important step. And as I think about some of the negotiations that are going on around the country and around the world with negotiations over coronavirus, I know that there's a lot of teachers that are incredibly frustrated because of the working conditions that they have. I know that there's a lot of safety concerns from teachers out there. And it strikes me that all of that noise that we hear on social media with teachers that are being frustrated in those different areas would probably be better organized if it was organized in a similar kind of way, where it started with small, actionable, small actions that are cohesive, that bring people together. But I see Noah's back. We lost him for a minute, but when he jumps back on, I want to ask him his thoughts on the pandemic and some of the lessons from Red for Ed. So Noah, we lost you for a minute, and I went on a little monologue to kind of give my thoughts on things. But we're gonna have you jump back in. So you were talking about the power of starting with a small actionable item and working up to the point where there were multi-day walkouts, in Arizona, in Phoenix, on the Capitol. So pick it up from there and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so essentially what I was saying was we continue to build, and we continue to build, and not only with the idea of continuing to engage the people we're already engaged with, but growing that base and expanding that nest. And what does it look like to engage parents in a different manner? What does it look like to engage people in the community who maybe aren't parents, but still live and care about this community? What does it look like to engage with people who are living on the Navajo reservation or speak a language other than English. And so one of the things that we did to not only base us more locally in that sense, but to also give teachers more power was we created the system of site liaisons. And it was essentially site liaisons would lead their school or their entire district. And they really just ran with that. So we gave them like the tools, really simple tools, like here are the people in your district who have given us information to contact. Here are some of the actions that we're suggesting you do, and here's how you kind of gauge engagement with those. And they just ran with it. And that was one of the most powerful things that we had, was these local teachers who really ran the movement.
Yeah, what was the role of social media in bringing people together?
Social media was really huge. I think just the ability to talk as quick as we could talk, and to talk to as many people as we were able to talk to, and to post events and have the address shared. I mean, it really just kind of streamlined a lot of the stuff. So for me, it wasn't like the definitive factor, because the definitive factor for me was the things that all these site liaisons were doing with the individual teachers who maybe weren't even site liaisons, but were so dedicated, were doing. And social media was just like made it all run so much smoother and so much quicker. So something could come out at 4 o'clock. The governor says something, and we could be on the streets by 4:10 with a good amount of people because of social media.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the chapters was written in the book was written by Melissa Tomlinson, who's the executive director of the Badass Teachers Association, and she talks a lot about the role of social media in organizing people in the same way. And I know that Educators United kind of sprung out of the Red for Ed movement, and they've now kind of partnered with the BATS, and all of these different grassroots movements have kind of merged and melded and are working together for the betterment of teachers and kids. So that's I think that makes a total sense what you're talking about, and how things can move quick and be streamlined with social media. Question that I want to ask, and this is what I was starting to opine about when I was going on my monologue when we dropped for a second. Had you started with, okay, we're frustrated, there's a lot of teachers that are upset, let's march on Phoenix, like let's march on the Capitol, do you think that there would have been the same turnout as you had? Was there that kind of excitement or anger or emotion that allowed for that to happen under the scenes, or was that something that kind of built over time?
I don't think so. I think the anger, the emotion was there, but I don't think the trust of, all right, we're going to take this serious action together. That takes time to build. The fact that we were able to build it in 2 or 3 months, I think, is almost a miracle. Like we can look at LA, we can look at CTU, we can look at Oakland. These are unions who built that trust for years and years and years, through elections, through all sorts of things. For us, I mean, nobody elected me anything, and they didn't elect the other people. I mean, we were just moderators on a Facebook group. So I think we needed the time, and we needed the deliberate organizing effort to build and to get to that point. We can look at other spaces. Oklahoma had really great organizers and did some really great things. But their Facebook event, I think, came out, and the name of the Facebook event was like, we're going to go on strike, or we're going to do a walkout on this day. And they did not have the same outcome that we've had. And I think that continues now. It's even with some divisiveness with some of the more grassroots activists and some of the more union-oriented folks, that still persists. And so I think we did a lot of work on relation building, building trust, and listening to not only teachers, but their communities. And I think that was really, really vital.
Yeah, one more question before we shift and talk a little bit about the pandemic and how some of these lessons can translate. When you think about teachers in Arizona, I'm sure, I mean, my first year teaching was Arizona, but it was back in 1997, so it's been a while. But when you think about teachers in Arizona, and I would imagine that they're like teachers in most places, where a lot of them tend to not be political. A lot of them try not to rock the boat, right? You know, they may have strong opinions about their job, but they're certainly not voicing them in political spaces. But obviously that changed. Talk about the difference that you saw in teachers that might have not engaged in this kind of activity before, in seeing the importance of them stepping into political spaces as a teacher, as part of their professional identity through this movement.
Yeah, I mean, night and day. Teachers, I think a lot of teachers were afraid to even really make a lot of the critiques that we eventually made together, or definitely to take the actions that we all took together. I think the big thing for us, when I say us, I mean everybody who's involved in this movement, is asking how we keep those people engaged, because a lot of those people who come to mind when you ask that question, I'm not sure they're as engaged as they were in 2018. And part of that, I think, might be some of the excitement of that moment is gone. And some of the bigness, the largeness of this action of we're going to go march on the Capitol is gone. And now it's been years, multiple years of tough organizing of like, all right, now how are we going to go back and sit at the table with our admin and hammer out this contract? Or how are we going to get a plan together to get our union revitalized? Or how are we going to go out and knock doors for a school board campaign? That's a much different type of organizing than getting people fired up and ready to take a big action and take a job action. So that's the question for me. We saw a huge engagement. We saw teachers flip from being essentially apolitical to being incredibly politically involved. But I feel like that started to trail off a little bit. So the question for me is, how do we get back to some of that work and keep all these folks engaged in the same way? And I'm not sure if we can, but we can, of course, push in that direction.
Yeah, so that's actually a great transition. You mentioned negotiations with school boards, right? Across the country right now, there's a lot of different negotiation going on over working conditions when it comes to health and safety, when it comes to different roles that teachers are being forced to take, whether it's a hybrid model that they're going into, negotiating how many kids are going to be in their classroom, how they're going to teach online and in person at the same time. All of those things are being negotiated. And those negotiations are difficult because of the new landscape that we're in. Everyone's trying to do, what they think is best for kids and also best for the community. But teachers are often having a tough time having their voice heard in those discussions. And a lot of it is because of, we talk about flipping the system, and at its very core, flipping the system is flattening that top-down hierarchy where teachers don't have input into those decisions at all different levels of the education system. But especially here, there's a lot of teachers voice in those decisions, and they're on their backwards to negotiate these different things. What lessons from the Red for Ed movement and from your experiences can you give to teachers that are in those situations where they're trying to fight for better working conditions, for better learning conditions for their students in this kind of environment?
Yeah, one of the things, I mean, first of all, I think I have to acknowledge that it is like a really difficult situation and a really difficult problem of how you organize in this moment. But one of the things that comes to mind for me is just the visibility of what we did and what we do as teachers on a day-to-day basis. So for us, and not only in Arizona, but I think this was the case in Oklahoma as well, and maybe West Virginia, they made a point to circulate working conditions, photos of those working conditions, and some of those ended up on the cover of USA Today. I think Time Magazine ran a story with some of those as well. And I think that was one of the biggest things, because I think as teachers, and this was true for me up until about 2018 when we started to act, kind of suffer in silence, or we suffer in silence plus the break room conversation, and we're like, oh man, it's another day of this, and I don't have the textbooks, and I have too many kids in the classroom, and that was kind of the space where we opened it up. I don't know, unless you have a parent or a child in those classrooms, if you see a lot of that. I know that a ton of the people that I met through Red for Ed didn't see that if they weren't teachers or weren't parents. And so I think one of the biggest things is to make it visible and to make it pronounced, and not only the bad things, but also the good things. Because that was another thing that we did, was to lift up some of the good moments that are happening and to show that this space, a public school classroom, and this relationship between the parent and the teacher, or the parent and the teacher and the student, is something worth not only retaining, but fostering and putting money towards and developing. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is making some of this struggle visible. And social media can be a huge help in that. Local journalists, I'm sure I see in Arizona, still report on these sorts of things as well. And then the other thing, I think the biggest lesson from Red for Ed is just confidence that not only you can do it, but the people around you can do it as well, that you're actually capable of quite a bit, especially with social media now, especially with some of the leveling almost of the field with social media, where you can pretty much generate the same audience that anybody can to a certain extent. I mean, it comes with limits, but you can really make your voice heard. And especially when you band together with other people, you can really make your voice heard, and you can really push things out, and you can organize quickly. And so I think having the confidence that you can do that work, no matter who you are, that's one of the biggest things. And knowing that the person next door can join you in that work. And it might not look the exact same for every single person. And we all have different limits, and we all have different possibilities. But putting those pieces together and just trusting yourself, and realizing that I not only have a voice, but I have power and I have agency to dramatically change this situation. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from the Red for Ed movement, that teachers have much more power to shift things than I think we thought before, at least than I thought before.
Yeah. You mentioned the photos. I'm curious, one of the things that I noticed as an outsider, watching what was going on in Arizona, Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia, during that Red for Ed time, over 2018 and and beyond, when it was really at its peak, was not just the photos but the narratives that were coming out. And from all of those different states, all of those situations, there were constantly teachers telling stories. Is that something that developed naturally, or was that intentional? Was there any specific training of teachers or conversation on how to tell a narrative? Talk about the role of narrative in the movement.
I mean, it's huge. I think you're exactly right. It played a vital role. As far as training, no, at least that I was aware of, no training on how to tell these sorts of stories. So I think a big part of it for teachers is, part of our job when we're teaching is to tell stories, maybe not our own stories, but other people's stories as well. And so teachers, I think, really take to that naturally. In Arizona, they did, and they were, you could pretty much put any teacher there on camera, and they were going to give you something that was just incredibly powerful. And I think it speaks to, an ability to communicate effectively, an ability to tell stories, but also just the deep emotion of the moment that was going on. I would turn on the news all the time and see teachers in tears about what was happening to their students in their school. So I think that was part of it too, of just the sheer emotion of, I have to express what's going on inside of me right now, or the things that I'm seeing happen to these kids every single day. So there wasn't any sort of training or anything. I think it was just who these teachers are and how much they care. And anytime they got the moment to share that story, they did so, and just some of the most beautiful and heart-wrenching ways, and really showed just how vital and how important that moment was, and still continues to be.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time, but I have a couple more questions I want to ask you. And I think one of them is, for those that are just watching and may not be totally familiar with what went on in Arizona, what were the outcomes? So what did you end up winning as a result of the protests that you had, in the state capitol and the entire Red for Ed movement back in 2018?
Yeah, the big quote unquote win was getting a 20% raise guaranteed from the governor and getting some money set aside for that. So that looks different at every single district because they really left it up to the districts. But most teachers received a 20% raise because of this. And we also really fought hard for support staff to get raises as well. And so a lot of support staff also received them. Again, it kind of depends on the district, but most that I know, and most of the situations I've heard of, not only did teachers get it, but support staff. But it still leaves this issue, right, of per pupil funding. And so now we can look to Arizona, and they're on the verge, hopefully, it looks like, of passing a new proposal to actually fund the schools, to tax the rich and to fund the schools, and to get money into the schools, not just for teacher raises, but to make sure that there are textbooks for the students and that there are tires on the bus and all these sorts of things that weren't in the 20% pay raise, which was a great win, but left a lot still to be accomplished, and a lot to be done in terms of that $1.1 million deficit. Sorry, 1.1 billion. I wish it was 1.1 billion. Yeah, billion. $1.1 billion. So that's where it is now. And in November, hopefully they'll get that passed. It looks good right now.
Yeah. So, but before we wrap up, all of these Red for Ed movements, these smaller Red for Ed movements that kind of broke off and worked in parallel but in different places, focused on change at the state level. And I think that's really important to point out when we talk about the American education system, because of the way that we're decentralized. So often there's so much focus on the US Department of Education and who the Secretary of Education is, and what that person and what that department is trying to do. But talk about the power to change things at the state level and how that impacts individual schools, individual teachers, and individual students.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was almost a no-brainer that was the level we were going to have to talk. Because when we talk about this $1.1 billion deficit, it's because of what the state is doing. They were giving tax cuts to corporations and millionaires. They're cutting money out of the school budget. So for us, the idea to target the federal government as the people who needed to kind of pony up and give more money didn't enter the equation as much as the state level, because they were the ones setting up the budgets and shortchanging us time and time and time and time again. So for us, it became apparent that's where the issue lies. It lies with what's happening at the state capitol, with the governor, with the Senate, with the House of Representatives, and that needed to be the focus. And then instead of focusing locally in terms of like school boards and superintendents and that sort of thing, it also became apparent that they were working with very limited budgets. So yes, we need to go there, and we need to sit down and bargain over contracts, and we need to talk about where that money goes once the state allocates it. But when they're not allocating enough to even buy anything, essentially, well, then we need to go talk to the people at the Capitol. So that's what we had to do.
Yeah. Well, Noah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for taking some time on a Friday. Thank you for the phenomenal chapter and being willing to tell the Red for Ed story in the book. I can't wait till other people are able to read it. Only about 2 weeks now, October 30th. We actually, it will actually be shipped and get in people's hands. But for those of you that are just joining us, this was Noah Karvelis talking about his chapter in Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy. So Noah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
We'll talk soon.
Later.
Bye-bye.